It's the morning after the night before, and Sir Keir Starmer has just become the 7th Labour Prime Minister in history. This is the Shock News Podcast. I'm Alfie Mulcahy, and I was at the Count at Dover and Deal in Kent.
I'm Callum Ewing, and I was at Rochdale Leisure Centre.
I'm Luke Jones, and I was in Telford for the Telford and the King.
I'm Sam Stimpson, and I was at the Count for Manchester Rusholme in Manchester.
So last night was obviously an historic victory for Labour. At the current totals, they've got 412 seats at time of recording, which is really quite close to what the exit poll predicted. But let's go back to 6 weeks ago on a damp day in Downing Street when Rishi Sunak called that election. Where were you guys? Sam, where were you?
I had just got home, so my coach got back to Coventry around midday, and actually no, it was after that. It was mid-afternoon, and then as soon as I came back was when it was on the news, and I just ignored my entire family because Rishi Sunak was getting absolutely drenched.
What about you, Luke?
I was just in my flat. I remember I was going out somewhere. I can't remember where, but I didn't want to leave until Rishi made that announcement.
Callum?
I had just arrived back from Switzerland in the early hours, and I went to the student union to pick up something from Shock, and then he announced it there and then. So I was actually in shock when he announced that it was going to be a general election.
How exciting! And it's been a hectic 6 weeks, and I guess you could kind of say that this election has been kind of controlled by the polls. It seems like we've had a poll every single day saying something ever so slightly different. But what are you guys' thoughts on that? Callum, do you think the polls have kind of helped shape the outcome?
Yeah, I think there hasn't been a lot of jeopardy with this election, just mainly due to the fact that obviously with the early polls showing how much Labour were going to win by. So it's kind of really been a foregone conclusion for the past few weeks. It's just been how many votes Labour can win by. I don't think the Tories have helped themselves with their campaign. Have been straight away, even with the announcement in the rain, it just kind of signified a downpour of sadness for the Conservatives during this campaign. And yeah, I just think it's been a procession really for Labour over the past few weeks.
It has kind of been a parade of mess ups from the Conservative campaign headquarters. You launched it in the rain, then you took your leader out early from an important international event. Just things like these kept coming, and normally in elections you see a narrowing of the polls towards the end, but Tory support kept falling. And Sam, I know over the course of the campaign you took a deep dive into the manifestos for your TikTok page. Do you want to talk about how you think that might have influenced people's votes, whether they felt swayed by what the parties have said?
I think a lot of people didn't trust the manifestos. So we've seen 14 years of Conservatives, and we've seen so many analysis of have they actually committed to what they said. At that point, people have just not lost trust in the Conservatives, but as politicians as a whole. We don't know whether we can hold any of the parties accountable because none of the other parties have had a chance in office to prove themselves. So it's I think it's led to a lot of complacency. Like people just don't think it's worth their time and just don't think it's going to be worth a vote if they can vote for something, but they don't know if it's actually going to happen.
There's been a lot of talk about how Labour's manifesto especially hasn't been that inspiring, hasn't been inspiring enough to get people on board with their model. Do you think any other parties have done that a bit better?
Well, I think they didn't have anything that caught anyone's attention. So with the Conservatives, you had the big shot of national service. Reform, you had their promises about lowering, increasing the minimum amount of pay tax. And then Lib Dems with the sewage and potentially rejoining the EU. And then Labour didn't have anything that was eye-catching. They had little bits in like telly interviews about schools and the VAT thing on private schools for public schools. That was probably the biggest thing when people want to change a news story. They just lost interest.
And you mentioned Reform there, and their manifesto had, I think it was something like 18 times as much spending as Labour's manifesto, and the Greens were quite up there as well. It's kind of shown that these two smaller sort of upstart parties are. Do you think they were over promising, trying to get support by promising more than could realistically be delivered?
Well, first of all, I've got to correct you because it is a contract, not a manifesto.
It's a contract for the British people.
You've got to get it right, Alfie. And when it comes to the smaller parties, I think they promise something because they want to get radical support. So they want to make radical promises. Because if they just say, oh, we're going to do this, they're not going to get any. If they do the same as Labour spending, they're not going to get as dramatic, attention. If they do, oh, we're going to do something so exciting, we're going to spend so much on one thing, say with Greens on all their environmental pledges, then people know that they are determined to commit to it. But then at the same time, the Institute of Fiscal Studies have just analysed all this data and like, it's not actually reliable what they said. So then again, if the public are looking at these reports from the IFS, they do tend to lose trust in politics.
And the IFS have said that any government will likely have to raise taxes, but every one of the parties has gone, we will not raise taxes on the work.
Yeah, I mean, the people don't want to see more taxes. It's already pretty harsh as it is. And Labour have said that they're going to put a triple lock on taxes. And that would be good, but at the same time, is it feasible? And with the Greens, yes, the Greens, they want to do a bit of a more extreme tax. So it wouldn't be taxing the working people, it would be taxing the super rich, which some people might see as unjustified. So it's quite decisive and again, a bit radical.
Well, one of the other things that's kind of characterised this campaign has been the number of TV debates we've had. So this is the fifth election in the UK where we've had election debates. The first one was in 2010. Luke, I know you've watched all of them. Do you think that that's had any sort of bearing on where public opinion has lied, or do you think everyone was already quite set in who they were going to vote for?
I think it kind of just solidified who people were going to vote for, because some of the candidates, they struggled in the debates, and obviously you had a few arguments as well when Penny Mordaunt and was it Angelina Rayner as well, when they've been on.
Penny Mordaunt, of course, who lost her seat last night, and she was tipped by some to be the next big thing in the Conservative Party, but she's out.
I think she still will be somewhere down the line, but for now, I think she's gone for now.
Leadership contest in 2030?
Possibly sooner.
Well, 2030, 2029 has been something Nigel Farage has been going on about a bit this campaign. He says that his aim wasn't to win too many seats this election, but that in 2029, Reform would be the second largest party. And we've seen tonight in loads and loads of constituencies, we've seen Reform coming in second. The North East, big Leave voting area, traditionally very Labour, loads and loads. The second place is no longer Tory, but Reform. Callum, what do you kind of think about that? How big the Reform vote's been?
I think the main thing about Reform in this election is that it's kind of taken away a lot of votes from the Conservatives. So obviously they were going to lose a fair few seats to Labour just based off the last 5 years or so that they've been in power. But I think when Farage suddenly came back to lead Reform, I think a lot of people who didn't want to vote for Labour suddenly thought, oh, we've got another option here. We don't have to vote for the Conservatives. We can vote for this Reform Party that is promising radical change. So I do think in the long run that Reform might be something to keep an eye on. As I say, their main role in this election was definitely to steal votes off the Tories, because if you see in some of the constituencies, a lot of the time it is Reform second rather than the Conservatives, if it's a Labour winning constituency. So it is something definitely to keep an eye on.
And sort of the interesting thing about Reform is the exit poll predicted that they'd get 13 seats, and the pollsters were very unsure about that. They ended up with 4. Nigel Farage still says that's a big victory. They got almost 15% of the vote. That's more than the Liberal Democrats got. Sam, that kind of shows that something is inherently wrong with our with the way we're doing elections now, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it means that 15% of people across the country have now voted for reform. And you think, oh, that's, not it's as big as Labour. That's still quite a lot of people. I don't know the exact numbers of the population or how many people voted, but you see all over social media. Tristan Tate went on Twitter the other day and encouraged young British men to, get their voices back and vote for reform. And as a little side note, quite interestingly, he is the biggest donor for George Galloway's Workers' Party. So really interesting what Tristan Tate's doing, getting involved in British politics. And then again, with older voters, there's a lot of young first-time voters that are going for reform. And then a lot of dissatisfied former Conservative voters who do agree with stopping the boats and getting rid of refugees, who haven't seen that under those Conservatives and now want to do that through reform. We saw Nigel Farage promised to get migration to 0.
Do you think now we've effectively got a parliament that is loaded with Labour MPs and then a smattering of the other parties, all on relatively low seat totals? Do you think we'll see a push in the next 5 years or however long this term lasts? Do you think we'll see a kind of push for proportional representation? Do you think we'll have another referendum? What do you guys think?
I think it's probable because Liberal Democrats are for proportional representation, and they've got a few more voices than they had last time.
Yeah, and Reform and the Greens will want to push for it. There was some talk last night that the Conservatives, if they were to have got under 100, which they haven't tonight, but if they had got under 100, whether they'd want to support that sort of newer system. Looking at the numbers here, you have the Conservatives on almost 7,000, but you've got Reform on 4,000, Liberal Democrats on 3,000, on 3 million rather, all millions. Not to accuse theirs off there, but you've got the Liberal Democrats on 3.5 million and Reform on over 4 million. Yet the Liberal Democrats have got over 70 seats and Reform is stuck on 4. Nigel Farage isn't going to shut up about this.
No, he's not. I don't think it is very fair how it's done. Like, Reform got more share of the vote by 2%, and it does need to change.
And I think we really could see that in the next couple of years. But Labour has said it's not on their agenda at all. But I wonder if, because relatively speaking, Labour's share of the vote is quite low. It's roughly the same as Corbyn got in 2017, and Corbyn lost quite dramatically.
34%.
Yes, yeah. And they've delivered one of the biggest majorities ever, one of the biggest Labour majorities ever, biggest since 1997. Not quite as big as Tony Blair's, but they've done that on a lesser vote share than what has gone down as one of their worst defeats. So whilst they're in a strong position in Parliament, in the constituencies with the voters, they're not as strong as they look from that initial seat total.
No, they're definitely not. I think it's also clear in Keir Starmer's constituency himself. I think his voter share was down by about 18.9%. They still won it quite handsomely, but it does show that it shows that I don't think a lot of people have a lot of trust in Keir Starmer as a Labour leader. I think a lot of people have just been voting for Labour just to get the Tories out, just because of how rubbish they've been over the last 5 years or so. It'd be interesting to see the first crisis points for this Labour government, how people react to their decisions, because I do see that they might lose a lot of trust quite quickly if it doesn't go according to plan in some people's eyes.
And we mentioned Farage earlier and him wanting to bring in a proportional representation system. Do we think that Reform doing as well as they have done is mostly the Nigel Farage effect? So we saw in, I think it was the second week of the campaign, where he effectively forced a switch of places between him and Richard Tice, the chair of Reform. Do you think we would have seen the same or similar result last night if Richard Tice was still the face of the party, or do you think Farage has been the vote winner?
I think Farage, being the character he is, he's definitely helped push Reform to do so well.
Yeah, I would agree. I also think it's also because Farage is just seen as this maverick politician that, you know, it's the first time he's been elected as an MP in this election. But he's always been seen as someone that's up against the established political parties, and he also carries over, I'd say, quite a lot of voters from UKIP and from the Brexit Party. I think a lot of those people more follow Nigel Farage rather than follow a certain political party. So I do think that Farage coming back to Reform definitely helped their case in a lot of areas, because they as I say, people gravitate towards Nigel Farage.
And 8th time lucky for him personally. He stood in 7 elections before in various different seats, but this is the first time that he's actually got into Parliament.
It is Clacton, I think it is, isn't it? That is now his MP form
in Essex.
So in Essex, I think gone off.
And that sorry, Callum.
It's Clacton definitely in Essex. I think he won it quite convincingly as well. It wasn't very close. So
8,000.
8,000, there we are. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Farage as an MP is different from Farage, who was always trying to knock down that door and has finally broken through, as he says, the 8th attempt.
And Clacton, of course, was home to the only UKIP candidate that ever made it into the House of Commons. And Farage said, a couple of months before the election, that he didn't particularly like Clacton as a place, and that he wouldn't ever think of standing there. And then suddenly he wanted to move there and make a difference to the people of Clacton. Now, we've been across the country tonight. Sam, if we start with you, what was kind of the story of the night where you were? How did your seat change, and what's kind of your experience being at that count?
Well, I was at Rusholme, which is actually one of the new constituencies. So it was formed equal split from Manchester Central and Manchester Gorton to create this new seat, Rusholme. And there were 7 candidates, and I totally made the mistake in the interview of saying that there was 8, but I didn't really notice. It was fine. So 7 candidates, and only one of them had experience in office, and that was the Labour candidate, Asal Khan, who was now the MP for Rusholme. So none of the candidates had experience. Only 3 of them turned up out of the 7, which is interesting to see, because, you know, we were there from 10 till 6. But it was a very interesting night. It was a new experience. It started off, as I entered, there was a protest outside. And so there was quite a heavy police presence inside and out of the building, which is it makes you feel a bit secure knowing that it is going to be an okay event when there are police there. It's equally unsettling. And then I don't know about any of you, if you experienced the rain last night, but that also, it made a damp start. It was like, made us think about Rishi Sunak a bit and what happened to him tonight. Yeah. We
didn't have rain on the way in, but at 5 o'clock in the morning when we left, it was starting to rain, and when we were about 10 minutes from the train station, because it was about a 45-minute walk, it just started tipping it down, and we got quite soaked on that last leg back to the station. But it was fine.
Did it make you miss Manchester?
Yeah, made me feel nostalgic for the north. Luke, what was your experience of the night like?
I think it was pretty quiet. Not a lot happened. Like, obviously I was covering 2 seats, Telford and then the Wrekin. And Telford, Labour gained from the Tories, and the Tories managed to keep hold of the Wrekin.
So did they? What was it quite tight in the Wrekin, or did they have quite a big majority?
It It was fairly close, a few hundred votes, but the Tory candidate, Mark Pritchard, he's been their MP since 2005, so yeah, staying on.
So that's a relatively short majority, but it's not the smallest that we ended up seeing. There was one, and I can't remember who it was, but one of the seats was on something like 25 seats, 25 votes between him. It was a Conservative that got redelivered, and the next place. I can't remember which seat it was, but it was just 20 seats in it. Really, really quite close. What about you, Callum? What was Rochdale like last night?
So Rochdale was quite a busy polling station. There's quite a lot of media around, including our very own Fletch. Because Rochdale was always one of the most interesting polling stations or interesting constituencies, I should say, for this general election, because obviously there was a by-election in February due to the death of Sir Tony Lloyd, the veteran Labour candidate. And so they went to the polls just in February, and George Galloway, kind of a shocking result, became the MP for Rochdale for the Workers' Party. So it was very interesting to see whether that would maintain in this election, only 5 months after the last one. And it was quite close. There were 6 candidates in total. We had Paul Wall from Labour Co-op, because it was one of the Labour Co-op candidates rather than just strictly Labour. We had George Galloway. We had Martin Savin from the Green Party. We had Councillor Andy Kelly for Liberal Democrats. We had Paul Ellison for the Conservatives. And we had Michael Howard for Reform. Going into it, it was always looking like it was going to be between Labour and the Workers' Party. That was what the forecast was. And it was, at the end result, it was between those two. So Paul Wall won on 13,027 votes, and George Galloway got second with 11,587. So it was about 2,000 difference between them both. And then Michael Howard for Reform got third with 6,773. So it was a very interesting polling station to keep an eye on.
Paul Wall, of course, former journalist of The Spectator and The Independent and The Eye at various points. And Michael Howard, it's not the Michael Howard, former leader of the Tory party.
It is not Michael Howard, former leader of the Tory party. He got
a new Michael Howard.
Action. It's a Michael Howard.
Michael Howard
Reform. Michael Howard II. Michael Howard from Reform, who does not like speaking to the media, as he did not make an appearance at all. Same with Mr. George Galloway, who did not make an appearance at all.
Interesting. I wonder if he thought he was going to win if he'd have showed up.
I think he heard that he might. It was too close to call, and I don't think he wanted to be there as a loser.
Yeah,
because all the other party members for the Workers' Party or the councillors who were battling for George Galloway or wanted him to win all turned up, apart from George Galloway. He didn't make a single appearance. It was just which was a shame, because there was quite a few questions that I'd like to ask him, including the Tristan Tate part. But yes, he did not make an appearance. And Paul Wall, actually, I should mention, only turned up 10 minutes before the declaration. So the two leading candidates in Rochdale, I think, had a grand total of maybe half an hour at the actual event.
And those smaller parties and the independents like Galloway have kind of been a bit of a thorn in Labour's side, because they've lost several seats to independent or smaller parties tonight. So whilst they've made those huge gains, they've lost quite a few seats in their heartlands to, in some cases, they're standing on a pro-Palestinian ballot. In Jeremy Corbyn's case, he's continuing as an MP, but as an independent. That result, I believe there was a little bit of a recount there. Jeremy Corbyn's team was very confident of that result about an hour and a half before any declaration was made. They kind of called it a good 90 minutes before that they'd won it clearly. And there are other places around the country where a seat has fallen from Labour to Tory,
yeah,
because the vote's then been split between Labour and an independent.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been various shocks around the country with concerns to Labour losing seats. I think one of the most interesting ones for me was Leicester South, which was Jonathan Ashworth, who lost to the independent candidate, well, who has a great name for this type of result, called Shockat Adam, who won just under 1,000 votes. So a lot of areas where there's pro-Palestinian members. A lot of those constituencies voted for the independent candidate who was, campaigning hard on that certain topic, because a lot of people think that Labour's not quite challenging that topic as much as they should be doing.
And it is one of those few cases where you see a member of the shadow cabinet lose a seat. You often see cabinet ministers fall, but shadow cabinet, where they're in what should be safe seats, about to become the governing party, it's mad to see a seat like that, a member of the shadow cabinet, fall in such a way. And that's because Labour has been ruthless in cutting out the sort of left of the party.
Yeah, I think there was another one as well. I think it was Wes Streeting in Ilford. He was he's the shadow health secretary, Wes Streeting, yes. He only won by about 528 votes in Ilford. So that was another one that was a very close contest for the shadow cabinet.
Which is the sort of thing you're not used to seeing.
No, especially in an election where Labour has won by so much, that there's still talk about the shadow cabinet ministers losing seats. But I think that just shows we've been talking about reform, been talking about independent candidates, and I think it just shows how volatile the political spectrum is right now in the UK. I think, and as we were saying it as well with the voter share, how Labour is still the same as 2019 with Jeremy Corbyn. It's on the same level. Even though with this majority, I think it still shows that a lot of people are undecided what they want to vote for right now. They can sway one way quite quickly to another. It just depends on what a certain topic is said about.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's a future where it's not a two-party system anymore.
Well, there are a few people last night calling, again, for a more proportional system, akin to Germany, where every election there's a sort of 2010 on steroids fight for a coalition.
Yes.
Which it'd be interesting to see how that would work in this country, because we've been so used to having strong governments, and moving towards a more proportional system, we'd see more what was dubbed the coalition of chaos.
Yeah.
But just have to see. I spent the night in Dover and Deal in Kent.
Okay.
Immigration was one of the key issues that was fought there. Reform has been trying very hard in Kent and in Essex. That they're the Kent, Surrey, Essex are the areas that they've been putting a lot of effort into, trying to see whether they can get any of the vote. They've been running quite a harsh campaign in Dover, especially, focusing on small boats coming across right into the heart of that constituency. It's been Tory for years and years and years, along with most of Kent. Kent is pretty much as true blue as you can get, and loads of the seats have fallen. Most of the coastal seats in Kent have gone to Labour. The only two coastal areas in Kent that didn't end up going for Labour were Faversham and Mid Kent, and Herne Bay and Sandwich. And the reason in Kent the coastal seats have kind of fallen is because, like in other parts of the country, northeast especially, in Brexit voting areas, you've seen that huge uptick of support for Reform. So Reform here in Dover, they were the second party. They were about 1,000 seats in front of the Conservatives. Labour way in front with 18,000 votes, almost 19,000. But that traditional Conservative vote was really, really split between the Conservatives and Reform in that area. Throughout the night, there was kind of the feeling that Labour had won. The Liberal Democrat and Reform and Labour candidates that I spoke to, the Labour candidates didn't want to say it, but but Reform and Lib Dem and Conservative had kind of gone, yeah, we've lost here. And I was speaking to people throughout the night saying that in Dover and in Folkestone's another kind of hotspot for small boat crossings, that Reform had, that they'd been knocking on doors and lots of people have been saying, I'm voting Reform to stop the boats, which stop the boats is a very it's a Tory turn of phrase, but it's kind of been taken by Reform in this campaign.
And we've seen the statistics that the asylum seekers, only a small, I think it's like a tiny amount of the asylum seekers are actually by boats. So it's not a great deal of difference that they would make if they do stop the boats.
But that's a sort of question of optics, really, because when migrants come in on the Eurostar, on a plane, on the ferry, there aren't any good images. But when they're coming by boat, you've got the scope to get pictures from that is so much greater. So then that becomes the narrative, because that's what people are seeing, because it's the only kind of form of immigration that you can see in an image.
Yeah, I think it points to the fact that the more dramatic the images are in news, the more people gravitate towards the negativity of it. You know, if you as you were saying, Alfie, if you saw people, I don't know, lining up at a security gate at an airport, or you know, that wouldn't sell well. But if you saw them struggling to get on in a tiny boat, fighting for their lives to get over to the crossing, then that's obviously points to, you know, look at the struggle that they're trying to get over here. On a positive side, on the negative side, you look at it and go, "Oh no, we must stop these boats. Look, it's so easy to stop these little boats coming over the channel." You're not saying that if it's a big jumbo jet, are you? Because you know that's just doesn't fit the narrative.
And immigration has kind of been one of those issues that has framed this campaign. There's been a lot of talk about the Conservative Rwanda policy and whether the election was called now with the Conservatives knowing they might lose, so they didn't have to prove the policy by actually sending flights off.
Or there's the counter argument that the election was called when the economy was doing well.
Yes, well, it came the day after the inflation figures were updated, and it looked like the Conservatives had reached their target. But with interest rates, because the renewal date for that came up during an election campaign, the Bank of England decided not to alter them because they didn't need to sway the vote. So we got to wait until August. I think the next interest update is. We're going to wait until August for that fall in inflation to have any sort of change on interest rates. Whereas if the Bank of England had decided to take the inflation figure and adjust interest rates accordingly, we might have seen a bit more of a recovery in the Conservative vote, because whilst it's all well and good saying inflation has come down, that's not something you can really see immediately, whereas interest rates can be noticed pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think Sunak definitely called it at a time when it was bad, but it could have got a lot worse if you waited and waited and waited. I mean, they didn't have to call this general election until end of this year, even the start of 2025.
Yeah, the end date was something like the 15th of January, I think, was the last plausible date.
Yeah, last plausible date. If you've waited that long, I think it would have been perhaps even more of a crushing loss for the Conservatives, considering some of the infighting, considering the Rwanda bill having a lot of Conservative MPs backing against it now. The inflation rates, as we were saying, were getting better, but they could have easily skyrocketed back up again over the next few months. So I think he did call it at a point where he could say, look, you know, let's just have a vote about this, because we feel we've done a couple of things really well. let's see what Labour can do. But if you waited any longer, I don't think they would have had much to hang on to in their campaign.
Exactly. So us four, we've all been pretty nerdy. We've been stuck at electric counts all evening, not getting an awful lot of sleep. But there are some other of our shock members that have been out doing some far more fun things. So let's hear from Jodie Keane, who has been travelling back from Greece.
Hi, Alfie. Just got on the plane. I was through real quick because I was called on an answer line to a voice message. But my flight is 1:30 from Corfu to Luton. So 11:30 UK time. I'll get back at like 1:30. Fly home from Luton, Birmingham, go and vote. So if it's delayed, I'm not making it.
So she's one of those people that was away on polling day for the most of it. But she managed to get back and vote in the evening. But postal votes, there's been a real issue with getting them out to people this election. Royal Mail has said they've been prioritising them, but lots of people received them late, and there are worries that lots of postal ballots didn't reach polling stations last night.
1 in 5 of people didn't receive their postal votes, and that was a news online. I think it was Tuesday night, and I was like less than just over 24 hours until the election, and people couldn't vote. And if they were leaving, they were going on holiday the next day, they wouldn't get a chance to use their voice, use their vote. I actually watched someone at the polling booth, and she applied for a postal vote, because if you apply for a postal vote, you can't actually go into a polling booth and vote. So her postal vote was sent to her. So she was a student, so her postal vote was sent home. So her parents had it. But when she went to vote, she couldn't, because she had been registered for a postal one. So there's a lot of, I would say, discrepancies with it, but it wasn't thoroughly achieved across the country. 10 million people didn't receive their postal votes, and that's a big problem when it comes to democracy.
And especially in Scotland, where Scottish schools broke up, the majority of them last Friday or last Thursday. So lots of Scottish families would have gone on holiday over the weekend or at the start of this week. So postal ballots for them were really quite important. And a couple of councils in Glasgow set up what looked suspiciously like polling booths, but for legal reasons weren't, a week before. So a week ago on Thursday and Friday, they set up these polling booths where people could collect a spare postal ballot and put it in an envelope and put it in a temporary post box. So they were effectively voting at a polling station a week early. Because they've been so delayed and loads of people in Scotland will be on a holiday next week, they had to kind of act. Otherwise, loads of people in Scotland especially would have been completely disenfranchised.
Yeah, I think I read as well that I saw it just flicking through the news that apparently someone who's travelling on the Eurostar, he met a stranger, and he basically said, "I'm not going to get my postal vote in on time. Could you?" Because he's travelling from Paris to London. Could you then? He got a random stranger to do his postal vote for him by travelling from Paris to London, which is kind of insane. It just kind of shows how badly the postal votes have been affected when it comes to delivering them. Royal Mail did come out and say that they were not prioritising parcels, because there was a claim that postmen were prioritising parcels over postal votes, but we don't know if that's true or not. So it has been a bit of a chaotic time with the postal votes.
The big question is who's to blame for it. Is it the Royal Mail or is it the government?
And I think that's something that over the next couple of weeks, the Electoral Commission will find out how many post ballots have been missed. And I'm assuming there'll be some sort of investigation, because if that many people have been disenfranchised, it's a real problem for our democracy.
Yeah, especially because I think postal votes are getting more popular.
Yes.
I think a lot of times people were thinking, can I really be bothered to go to this polling station? Whereas now, if you just fill in a letter and post it away, that's encouraged a lot of people to vote. So if it is becoming more and more of a problem, that is going to be bad for our electoral system, as you say, because it's taken away another way of voting.
One thing I'd just like to touch on before we end this is, we haven't spoken much about the Liberal Democrats yet. And they ran a very bizarre campaign, but it has seemed to have cut through a little bit. Sam, you're laughing.
I mean, the stunts were an interesting series of events. So we've seen Ed Davey on the teacups, we've seen him on a water slide with Sky News's Sam Coates, and then in one day he did another water sport. But look, first of all, let's not forget about the surfing on Lake Liverpool. And then he did a Zumba class, and it is probably, I think that's probably contributed to why Lib Dems have done so good, because people are seeing, who is this guy? And he's talking about what he stands for when he's doing his votes. I mean, when he jumped and did that bungee jump, he went and challenged everyone to do something they hadn't done before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is to vote Liberal Democrats. Maybe people hadn't seen anything about politics and they heard him do that and they were like, sure, why not? Let's vote Lib Dems. I'm quite annoyed that I couldn't, but I was in the one constituency that didn't have Lib Dem standing because of an issue of paperwork. So it was one of the two constituencies in the UK that Lib Dems didn't stand for. So it was Manchester Brushhome and Chorley, where it is the Speaker's seat. Yeah, the Lib Dems have just been on a ride of events, and it's really shown what they stood for as well. Then outside of Ed Davey, it's also been that lovely, I think it was in Henley with Rishi Sunak.
Yes. That was brilliant. That was one of my favourite moments of the campaign.
Daisy Keeper did very well with that vote.
I think for that half hour they had it was something like an £800 they paid to hire that boat to go past with all the big placards.
They had a good campaign director whoever did it.
Yeah.
It was a smart move.
And it's sorry, Alfie, but it's not just fun and games for the sake of fun and games. I think we've seen with the votes as well that I think Lib Dems got about 61 seats. I think 61 seats, which is a fivefold increase on what they got in 2019, which is where they just got 11. And they have, especially down south, we're talking about Labour taking the coastal votes, but the Lib Dems have taken some of the most central Kent ones as well, because for the first time ever, Tunbridge Wells isn't Tory. It's now Lib Dems, and it wasn't even close. It was a good fair few distance between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. So I do think it's shown that Ed Davey, I think some people saw him as this, how Boris Johnson used to do all these little, I think there's that iconic image of Boris Johnson ziplining down with the British flags in his hands, and people kind of saw him as this buffoon. I think some people saw Ed Davey as this kind of like, oh, is he really a leader because he's doing all these fun and games? But it has shown it has worked. I think Ed Davey's been very smart about this. He's especially been, with Keir Starmer being a very, how do you say, reserved person in this campaign. Rishi Sunak obviously, being humbled and downpoured in more ways than one. I think Ed Davey just having a bit of fun with this election campaign, setting up the right way for a lot of people.
I think it's built a lot of trust, all the stunts, because he's done constant stunts. And, on the one level shows his commitment to the campaigning, and that does show to the electorate that he is committed.
Yeah, definitely.
Luke, do you have a favourite sort of viral election moment, whether that's an Ed Davey one or a different politician doing a stunt or something accidentally to get them splashed across social media?
I think for me it was definitely Ed Davey bungee jumping. Like, he just all throughout the campaign he just came across as, for me anyway, he just came across as normal.
There was an excellent split screen the night he did that bungee jump on Channel 4 News, where you had 3 columns of Tory, Labour, Lib Dem. The Tory column, you had Rishi Sunak I think it was in a hospital that day, meeting and greeting people. Sir Keir Starmer was at, I think, a school. And then you've got Ed Davey. His bit in this split screen is him flying off a bungee jump and bouncing up and down. Hilarious little split screen.
I want to know who planned all these stunts.
Yeah, and
unhinged.
And as you said, they must have a really great campaign coordinator. And obviously, the Conservatives for the last week and a half of that campaign had no campaign because he'd been suspended over gambling.
Cakes.
Which is one of the maddest little political stories I think we've ever had.
Nothing on this campaign, nothing in the past 6 weeks has been on a bingo card. Like, it's not unpredictable.
What was it in the end? 4 Conservative members, 2 of them as candidates, and then 2 close protection officers in the Met.
And a Labour one. And then
Yes.
Alistair Jack, one of the Conservatives, he didn't actually...
Scotland minister.
He hasn't done anything, like, he hasn't announced how much he bet or whether it was on the date of the election. He just did that he did bet. But he's actually on the honours list.
Yes.
Yes, he is.
As is Theresa May. Finally get time in the Lords after leaving the Commons.
Yeah.
Asking gifts.
She's got a peerage.
You have to follow the other well where you were based. Did you have an eye on the possible waiting around? Any that stuck out to you? Other results?
Yeah. At Rochdale, they had about 6 or 7 screens in the polling station of so you could keep track of all the rest of them. Obviously, Rochdale being quite close to a lot of the other constituencies. It was keeping a close eye on Bury South and Bury North. It was just nice. It was just interesting to see what constituency came through first in terms of the vote. I think it was Sunderland in the end.
Yes, Sunderland.
Yeah, that was first.
What was Sunderland South came in first, followed by Northumberland. And then it was what was the Blythe Valley, but it's now I think it's just Blythe now.
It's just Blythe, yeah.
I think they've removed the valley.
They've removed the valley.
Blythe and Ashington.
It's Blythe and Ashington, yeah. No longer Blythe Valley.
The valley's gone.
Yeah, and let's just touch on Salford briefly. I feel like we should, as we are Salford based. That's Rebecca Long Bailey holding Salford with a reduced majority, down 4.2%. Reform coming in second there, Green in third, and the Conservatives in fourth. Huge majority for Labour though. Majority of 15,000 in Salford. One of the safer seats we've seen tonight.
Now, just getting the numbers up here. So there were 7 candidates there.
And the Greens got all 4 seats they wanted to get, all 4 of their targets, keeping Brighton Pavilion and gaining 2 seats from the Conservatives and 1 from Labour. That one from Labour taking Thangham Debonair, one of the shadow cabinet, out of the House of Commons. And in Brighton Pavilion, Sian Berry standing for the Green Party. That's Caroline Lucas's former seat. She was at one point Green Party leader. And whilst they got the same number of seats as Reform, they got about half the vote share. They've led a very, very targeted campaign, the Greens.
Yeah, I think the difference between the Greens and the Reform is that Reform is very much, it can finish second or third in the constituencies and getting quite a large share of the votes. I think Reform's more widespread, whereas Greens, as you say, is very targeted. You know, if people want to vote for Greens, they usually end up winning it in the constituency that they're in. That's why Brighton Pavilion's always been a Green Party constituency. But it is interesting to see that Bristol Central with Carla Denier's now a Green as well, because I think she had I think she showed herself well in some of the debates that they had. I think she came off quite well.
And she's got quite a big, healthy majority there.
Yeah.
In Bristol Central, she's got a majority of over 10,000 votes, taking it from an incumbent Labour minister and a shadow minister, I should say. And whilst, as we said earlier, Labour has won across the board, there are these places where they've made losses to third parties.
Next to smaller parties, so we don't see that in Scotland, where the SNP have actually lost quite a fair amount of seats. We've seen it with the Lib Dem gains, and actually leading on to what Callum said about the Greens having those 4 set seat focus and the Reform going for a broad one. That is like because the Green Party want to secure voices in Parliament, whereas Reform are just going to secure an electorate for the 2029 election.
And Scotland is very, very interesting. The exit poll predicted the SNP would be on 10 seats. They're on 9 at the minute. That is way, way down from 2019 when they got 49 seats. That was huge. That was one of the headlines of the exit poll in 2019 was that the SNP was overwhelmingly huge in Scotland. And they've been reduced to just 9 seats in this election, which just goes to show, and that they're kind of suffering from almost double incumbent syndrome, where they're incumbent in Scotland, and there's a vote against them, and there's a vote against the Tories as well, and the natural party in Scotland for voters against Tories or SNP to go for is Labour. So you've had swings from the SNP to Labour and from the Tories to Labour in much of Scotland. But we have a friend of Shock, William Lawless, who is in Scotland, and he's been following what's been happening there.
Yesterday, we saw one of the most dramatic results of the election occurring in Scotland. A 16 percentage point swing away from the SNP, who have won every national election since 2010. Labour has finished around 5 points ahead of the SNP, which has translated into more than 4 times as many seats as the SNP. What this will mean is yet to be seen, but it could mean a disaster for the upcoming 2026 Hollywood elections for the SNP. In Scotland losing a seat, while Lib Dems look set to gain 4. The Reform Party struggled to break through in most constituencies, while the Greens have had their best Westminster result ever.
And the situation with the Scottish Greens is quite interesting because they are separate from the Green Party in England and Wales. They run on a very pro-independent ballot, and up until very recently in the Scottish Parliament, they were in a power-sharing agreement with the SNP. But Scotland, probably another big story of the night, how the SNP has fallen quite dramatically from grace. But that headline figure of the night, as we draw this to a close, Labour on 412, Conservatives on 121, the Liberal Democrats on 71, that's up 63, Scottish Nationalists on 9, Sinn Féin on 7, Reform on 4, the Greens on 4, and the others on 24. Thank you for listening. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you to everyone who's contributed, and we'll see you again.
Loving the shows you listen to on Shock? Why not listen to them again? Check out all your favourite Shock shows now. Just search Shock Radio on Mixcloud.